And I know you kind of stirred up the internet a little bit with this. Is it hereditary? Is it nature? Nurture? Give me the facts, doctor.
Yeah, I want to preface this by saying I was miseducated and misinformed in my own degree programs. And all my research that I did, including some of the research in my dissertation, I'll admit, was wrong because I was taught wrong about these disorders.
There you go.
So good science is about upsetting the status quo. You know, sometimes you have to get a little upset when you realize the truth. So there's a lot of people who get defensive about this. Like, how could you say it's people are born this way? It's nurture. It's been proven. Here's the problem. All of the data that show it's nurture only, has nothing to do with nature, is called anecdotal data. What that means is stories were told in therapy, and then interpretations were made by therapists about those stories. Now we have brain scans. Now we have neuroimaging technology. So back then, there was no way to know, you know, you just took people at face value. Right. Problem is narcissists, borderlines, there's a couple other in that category, histrionics, antisocial, the psychopath. They notoriously lie pathologically. So all the data was taking them at face value. And everybody knows that when you go to therapy, you talk about your childhood.
Right.
That's just what people know that to do. That's the first thing. Even people who like don't know much about therapy, they know that, you know, people talk about their childhoods in therapy.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Well, of course, narcissistic people know that. So when they talk about how their lives are unmanageable because of the chaos that's been brewed up, and the therapist says, tell me about your upbringing, they're going to be like, oh, well, yeah. I mean, I had a terrible upbringing. That's why I do what I do. Once we started doing like research where we could scan brains and all that kind of stuff, the empirical evidence that this is nurture really does go out the window. That's not to say that there's not an influence. There's always a social and environmental influence. But the predisposition is already there. So one myth about child abuse, for example, is that people who are abused in childhood grow up to be abusers. 80% of people abused in childhood do not grow up to be abusers in adulthood. So the most, let's say, empirical research, like we're talking about clinical research, we're not talking about stories told,
right,
shows that the genetic influence is much more prominent than people originally
What percentage
suspected.
is that? What is that?
I mean,
So
there are studies that show that narcissistic personality disorder is like 77 to 80% heritable. Mm-hmm. And this is going off of, like, again, empirical data. So it's going off brain scans. It's going off where you see deficiencies or deficits in certain areas of the brain that make traits.
So you're saying if husband and wife, one of them, let's say, is a narcissist, diagnosed, they have a child, that child has a 77% chance?
No, and that's a great question. So heritability, or I should say genetics, don't necessarily mean 100% guaranteed biological transmission. Okay. You can have two parents who don't meet the criteria for a personality disorder, and they can have a one child out of four that meets the criteria for a personality disorder. It's not like you're doomed because it's genetic. It's like a death sentence and there's no cure, but it's definitely more genetic than it is environmental. I think one of the things that causes people to have difficulty with this is for almost 100 years they were told that it was a nurturing issue. It was an environmental issue. And so it's really hard to wrap your head around the possibility that people might be born with this tendency.
So if somebody's born with it, when can they effectively be diagnosed? Or when can you start to see that? Is it 12? Is it 18? And are there things? Well, go ahead and answer that, and then I have a question to follow up.
So because we always were taught that it was an environmental, we actually weren't allowed to diagnose a personality disorder until someone's 18, because the theory was, well, they're still developing, so we can't really, put that label on them until they're 18. Even then, that's just legal adult age. That's not full brain development age. So there was a lot of controversy there. But when you see the clinical research that these signs are visible, like in 3-year-olds, that these kids are just different, it's not. then you can start, they call them different things. Like we have conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and then those things like conduct disorder, for example, goes into in adulthood like antisocial personality disorder. So they call it something different as it's like in the interim of development. But now with the clinical research, these things are visible and diagnosable very, very early on in life.
Okay. So a mom's sitting there, she has 2 kids, and one of them is, let's say it's a single mom, 2 children, one's perfect kid, no issues. The other one is exhibiting traits, and she starts freaking out. Oh no, oh crap, what do I do? You know, baby number 2 or child number 2 is a narcissist. What can she do? What can she do? Is there anything she can do?
Absolutely. So there is that percentage that is environmental or in social forces, right? So there's if you take like a psychopath, for example, which so many people define psychopathy differently, but a psychopath is somebody who completely lacks a conscience. So they don't have any guilt, shame, or remorse. Okay. There's some theory that if that person has good, responsible parents who nurture them in a way or teach them in a way, they are more likely to not act out these impulses or urges. They might become a CEO of a big company as opposed to becoming, a serial killer.
Right,
So
right.
there's that percentage of how much can we influence the behavior. But those traits are still inborn. They're still innate.
Gotcha.
So to answer your question, let's say, and by the way, there's a great book on borderline personality in children called Stop Walking on Eggshells for Parents.
Yep. Oh, for parents.
Yes, because it has vignettes and information about how these traits are obvious like early on in childhood. Yeah, so the Stop Walking on Eggshells for Parents was written because there are some parents that, like you said, they have this one child that seems to be pretty normal functioning, and then they have another child that they're at their wit's end. They're not responding to any sort of reasonable discipline or, anything like that. And so the parent is getting blamed by the school, the parent is getting blamed, by everybody, by therapists, but yet they have this other kid that's just not problematic. So it kind of, supports that nature research. But that doesn't mean that, again, it doesn't mean it's like that they're doomed. I would actually say the sooner you get the kid into therapy with someone who knows how to treat personality disorders, the better the outcome, because the behavior can start to be intervened on immediately versus it kind of setting in and being a bit more fixed, like in someone's 30s or 40s or, something like that.
Wow. That's good to know. That's really good to know. So it's not, as you said, it doesn't mean that, hey, if my spouse has it, my children will get it, from what you said. And then it's not I don't want to say a death sentence, but a doom sentence. No, it's not
a death sentence or a doom sentence. Well, if you look at autism spectrum disorder, for example, that's, 2 parents cannot have that, and then a child can. That's genetic, right?
Yeah.
I mean, no one...
There you go.
Some people still have an issue with that, but for the most part, no one's going to get real rattled if you say that that's genetic, because you've seen 2 parents not have it and then a child have it.
Yeah.
So that's how you can, that's, I would say, one of the best explanations for how like 2 parents who don't meet the criteria for a personality disorder could have a child who does meet the criteria. But again, it's not a death sentence or a doom sentence, like you said.
Jumping back, we were talking offline, and I want you to go into that about the nature and nurture and other cultures around the world and everything else. Do you mind going into that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, the research shows cross-culturally across the globe, these trait deficiency disorders, personality disorders, they exist. They're present. So that when you think about how diverse nurturing is in different cultures, right? I mean, something that would constitute abuse in America, and you'd get Child Protective Services called on you,
right,
but you're doing it in a different country. So there's a lot of cultural definition of what constitutes abuse, what constitutes good parenting. But across the board, these disorders are prevalent. I mean, that is because it's more of a genetic thing than it is of a nurturing thing.
Interesting. So I'm going to ask you this too. I guess you sort of answered it, but let's say there were twins born.
Well, twin studies are what a lot of this clinical research are. A lot of the findings come from twin studies.
Okay.
So you could take identical twins who were not raised together, for whatever reason, or who were raised together. Okay. So biological parents adopted in the foster care system.
Right.
And across the board, the research shows that it doesn't matter what the upbringing is or what the situation is. The traits are already there. There's genetic influence over it, regardless of the environment, regardless of, whether the biological parents, the traits are there regardless of blended families. So it's, a lot of times there's this theory that, the divorce and then the step parent caused the borderline personality. It's an attachment disorder. Not according to the empirical evidence. It's not. It doesn't matter what the location of your upbringing is or the style or type. There's not one single type of parenting style or one single parenting trait, if you will, that will predict the development of a personality disorder. It's just not in the research. It's in popular prevailing notion and beliefs about the research, but it's not in the actual research.
Do you think, you seem like you're so much on the forefront of this. Do you think that psychology will start stepping up and start to better diagnose, start to better treat, start to better manage, recognize than where they are? Or are they just, I know sometimes medicine's a little slow at adapting change, right? It's the way it's been taught, and sometimes not.
We like research and we like findings that support our beliefs. Right. Nobody wants to believe that this is something that's genetic. It makes more sense emotionally to believe that it was environmental.